Episode 8, Let the Games Begin, 80 to 89 AD. Hello and welcome back to 202 Decades. Before we start this time, I want to ask for some input from you. As you may be noticing, we are approaching the end of the first century. After covering the 90s, I will release an end of century episode to review, draw connections, and analyze the first century. Here's where you come in. Each century, I would like to address listener questions about the prior 10 decades. Maybe you've been wondering about the change in makeup of the legions during this century. Or maybe you have a counterfactual question like, what do you think would have happened if Boudicca's revolt had succeeded? Stuff like that. Please send any and every question to 202decades@gmail.com. That's 202decades@gmail.com. Or feel free to submit questions via Twitter or X to the 202 Decades account or to the 202 Decades Facebook page. Last time, we saw Titus complete the reconquest of Judea after its revolt, culminating in the fiery destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Elsewhere in the empire, the new emperor Vespasian had to deal with fallout from the chaotic year of the four emperors, which included revolts in Britain, Gaul, and most significantly, along the Rhine. At one point, the whole Rhine valley from Mainz to the sea had fallen into rebel hands. With much effort, order had been restored. Vespasian ruled well and stabilized the administration, instilling new blood into the government and helping the elite shed their extravagance in favor of administering more effectively. At least a little. The provinces flourished under his reign. And while taxes weren't low, they were at least enforced fairly and consistently. Roman citizenship was expanded and colonial status was given to many cities across the empire. In the last year of the 70s, Vespasian passed away and the title Princeps was passed to his son Titus. This marked the first time an emperor had passed the office to his own son. But the old dynasty, which had lasted over 80 years, was gone, and the Flavians had ushered in a new era in Rome. Titus immediately faced several challenges to his rule. Last time, we saw the first of these, the fire and ash of Vesuvius. We'll see the remainder this time during Titus's short reign. But first, here's what we'll cover this decade. Part 1, The Days of Titus. Part 2, The Years of Domitian. Part 3, Caledonia. Part 4, Meet the Dacians. And Part 5, Another Rhineland Rebellion. Part 1, The Days of Titus. As his father grew old in the last years of the 70s, Titus had been made co-emperor. Vespasian still called the shots, but it closed any question on the succession. We first met Titus Flavius Vespasianus 2 decades ago as he helped his father crush the Great Jewish Revolt. He proved himself an able leader of the armies under Vespasian. So much so that when Vespasian threw in his hat for the contest to become emperor, Titus was given the task of recapturing Jerusalem. In this, he had succeeded. He retook Jerusalem and captured the rebel leaders, bringing them in chains back to Rome. If we are to believe Josephus, the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem wasn't intentional, but other accounts suggest he may well have intended for the temple to be destroyed. This would fit with the reputation he gathered during his father's reign. During these years, Titus was made Praetorian Prefect, the leader of the Praetorian Guard. In this role, he was known for his harshness and for using the Praetorians almost as a secret police. The other major mark on his reputation, aside from his harshness, was his relationship with a Jewish princess named Bernice. Bernice was the daughter of Herod Agrippa, the man who had become influential in Rome and had helped secure Claudius as emperor after the assassination of Caligula. Her older brother, Agrippa II, was one of the moderates who, during the Jewish revolt, had sought peace with Rome, then had to flee Jerusalem as the city fell to the Zealot factions. Bernice had also been in the city at the time, and she fled with her brother. They both made their way to Vespasian's camp and here is where she met Titus. Although she was 11 years his senior, the two fell into a relationship. She would have traveled with Titus while he campaigned in Judea. Apparently, when Titus returned to Rome in 71, she did not immediately come with him. It would not be until 75 when she joined him there, possibly because of a feud between her and Mucianus, one of the governors who had secured the empire for Vespasian. When she did arrive in Rome, the two picked back up their relationship, and she lived at the imperial residence with him, acting as a wife. She became influential in the administration, but quickly her presence began to concern the public. They had a stigma against the influence of Eastern queens, a wound left by Cleopatra 100 years earlier. Under pressure and publicly called out for their relationship, Titus sent her out of the city in 77 or 78. Titus had passed the first test of public opinion. He shed the accusations of harshness quickly as well. As I mentioned in the intro, Titus faced several challenges outside his control almost immediately. First came the eruption of Vesuvius in late 79, which destroyed Pompeii, Herculaneum, and several other nearby towns. Ash had fallen thick on Naples, but cities as far as Rome had also been dusted. Titus responded to the disaster with compassion. He donated funds from the treasury for cleanup and for building homes for survivors. He personally visited the disaster area in 79 and again in 80, giving the people confidence by letting them see their leader by their side. On his second visit, Titus received word of a large fire that had broken out in Rome. This fire was severe, lasting 3 days. Although destructive, it was not as severe as the one during the reign of Nero, thanks in part to the fire safety reforms Nero had passed. Once again, Titus showed his face in the aftermath of this disaster and helped to rebuild. As the rubble in Rome still smoldered, a third disaster, or horseman, arrived: plague. It's unclear if the disease was limited to Rome or more widespread. Details are short on the source, the symptoms, and the numbers infected, but several historians of the period mention a severe outbreak hitting Rome. Cassius Dio attributes the pestilence to the effects of the ash cloud from Vesuvius. This attribution fits with the ancient theory of disease called miasma theory, in which diseases such as malaria, cholera, and plague were blamed on bad air, or miasma, Greek for pollution. Miasma theory was probably older than Hippocrates, but he, the father of medicine, supported the idea, and it was the dominant ideology in the ancient, medieval, and early modern world. Through the lens of this perspective, the miasma from the eruption fell upon the city, poisoning people with the bad air. With our microscopes and genetic testing, we have a more accurate and useful concept of disease today. Still, the identity of what caused this outbreak, which the ancient historians just call plague, is a mystery to us. An old guess was that malaria was to blame. But Titus probably died from malaria in 81, and his disease wasn't connected to this plague in the sources. Another hypothesis is an early form of bubonic plague, perhaps a less severe ancestor of the pandemic that will sweep across the world in the 500s and the 1300s. A 2023 article from Guglielmo Marconi University in Rome proposes that an especially severe strain of influenza caused the outbreak. According to the article, the descriptions in our ancient sources match up best with influenza. The authors also theorize a source. At the time of the outbreak, a large number of animals were being imported for feasting and celebrating the inauguration of the Flavian amphitheater, which we'll get to in just a moment. They, the authors, propose that a huge number of cranes, captured, slaughtered, and ate, could have sparked the spread of an H5N1 strain of influenza, a sort of bird flu. With no immunity to this strain, thousands died each day. But again, exact numbers aren't known. Before we get to the Colosseum, one quick aside. During Titus's short reign, a man appeared in the province of Asia, that's Western Anatolia, claiming to be Nero. The man apparently looked similar to the late emperor and was able to sing and play the lyre with skill. More than anything, this footnote shows the enduring popularity of the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, especially in the East. One last time, I'll say that although Nero carries a bad reputation due to our sources in the upper classes thinking him uncouth and paranoid, much of the public was devoted to him and they enjoyed his rule. Anyway, this false Nero gathered followers and with them he marched to the Euphrates River. He then sought help from the Parthians. They accepted him and began making moves to use him as an excuse to invade and reinstate him. But it soon became clear that this man was not Nero. Nero had been dead for 11 years. This false Nero was killed. Back in Rome, the great Flavian amphitheater, began by Vespasian in 72, was finally completed. The structure was, and still is, massive, 189 meters long and 156 meters wide. As a side note, I know I've switched between metric and imperial units frequently, but I've found it inelegant to list each distance or measurements in both units. As an American with a majority American audience, I can't commit to fully metric units. Distances in this series probably will be in miles, short measurements might be in feet and inches, middle distances might be in meters. If there's ever any confusion or you have another recommendation, please let me know. In height, the top of the Colosseum reached 48 meters, or about 14 stories tall. It could hold over 65,000 people, and at some points, additions were added to hold up to 80,000 people. The structure is elliptical in shape and fully enclosed, as if two traditional amphitheaters were attached together facing each other. Its exterior walls are a series of arches. The bottom floor allowed easy entry and exit through its 80 archways. The arches of the next two levels allowed light into the walkway, called the vomitoria, around the perimeter. It's thought that originally it had marble statues in each of the 80 archways on the upper floors. Inside the arena, seating was rigidly arranged based on social class. At the north end of the arena was box seating for the emperor and his entourage. Flanking this box on either side and wrapping around the lowest level was seating for the senators. Across on the south end was another box for the Vestal Virgins. Above the senatorial level was seating for the equestrians. Then above them was seating for the plebeians, divided into two sections with the wealthier sitting lower down. Here there were carve-out sections for schoolboys and their tutors, soldiers on leave, and foreigners. During the decade after it opened, a final level was added by Domitian, allowing seating or standing room for women, slaves, and the very poor. Wholly excluded from the Colosseum were actors, former gladiators, and gravediggers. The floor of the stadium was 83 meters long by 48 meters wide. It was made from wood and covered with sand, which is where it gets its name. Latin arena became arena. Its location is a large, flat area at the base of the Caelian, Esquiline, and Palatine hills. The area had been densely populated, but in 64, the Great Fire of Rome destroyed the neighborhood. Nero began building his Domus Aurea on the site and had a colossal statue of himself placed next to this golden house. After his death, the Domus Aurea was pulled down, and the site was used for the Flavian amphitheater. The colossal statue of Nero, though, remained for centuries, though remodeled after the god Helios. This colossus lent the new amphitheater its name, the Colosseum, due to its proximity to the Colossus. The choice of location was unusual. Amphitheaters were usually placed on the outskirts of town, but Vespasian picked this site to symbolically return the land Nero had appropriated for himself back to the public. The construction was funded by the spoils taken from the sack of Jerusalem. Some have even proposed that Jewish prisoners of war were used as labor to construct the Colosseum, although there's no textual evidence to back this up. Like the opulent triumph held after Titus's return and victory in 71, the Colosseum itself was a monument to the greatness of the Flavians and their generosity to the people of Rome. The top level was completed in late 80 or 81, and it was inaugurated with 100 days of games. The atmosphere in Rome must have been feverishly festive. Inside the stadium, the crowd would have watched performances, gladiator contests, of course, and animal hunts. Over 9,000 animals were killed in the Colosseum just during the opening games. It was a slaughtering field. Titus would have been present in his box seats for much of these games, giving the people a chance to see the face of their emperor and enjoy a spectacle thanks to his generosity. At the end of the 100 days, Titus closed the festivities by dedicating the amphitheater as well as a public bath he had financed. Unfortunately for Titus, this was his last act as emperor. He set out for the countryside to catch some fresh air. At his first stop, he began to feel hot. He had a fever that only grew worse. His last words were, "I have made only one mistake." He was only 41 years old, and he died after serving as emperor for only 2 years. It's now thought that Titus caught malaria, which was a constant scourge thanks to low, swampy lands near Rome. As for what his one mistake was, our sources say allowing Domitian to live and succeed him as the heir apparent. If we are to believe those were really his final words.
Part 2. The Years of Domitian. In 81 AD, Emperor Titus died after serving in the role for only 2 years. Upon his death, the natural successor was his 30-year-old brother and youngest son of Vespasian, Domitian. Domitian had long lived in the background of his father and older brother. When Vespasian and Titus rode through Rome on a chariot in their triumph, Domitian was relegated to riding behind them on a horse. When the Batavian revolt was at its worst, Domitian had volunteered to lead a legion to help crush the rebellion, but he was passed over for more qualified generals. Throughout Vespasian's reign, and even under Titus, Domitian was kept in the wings. Although he served as consul 6 times during his father's reign, 5 of the 6 times were as suffect consul. This was a less prestigious consulship. Here, someone else began the year as an ordinary consul, and then retired the year halfway through and was replaced by a suffect consul. The Romans named their year based on only the 2 ordinary consuls, though, not the suffect consuls, and thus it was the more honorable role. Domitian was often left to the back. In the years since Vespasian took power, Domitian married Domitia Longina, the daughter of the deceased general Corbulo. We talked about him in the 50s and 60s, covering his campaigns in Armenia and his defense of Syria from the Parthians. He had been forced to kill himself in 65. By marrying this daughter of Corbulo, Domitian not only married into Corbulo's reputation, but Domitia was also a great-great-granddaughter of Augustus. The marriage helped provide legitimacy by connecting the Flavians with the Julio-Claudians. Domitian and Domitia. Cute. Domitian had been with his brother on the retreat from Rome when Titus suddenly grew ill. As Titus's condition worsened, Domitian didn't wait for his brother to die. He quickly rode back to the city to the Praetorian camp. After making his promises to the Praetorians, his accession was secured. The following day, the Senate voted to confirm Domitian's tribunation powers, the titles Augustus and Pater Patriae, and the office of Pontifex Maximus. With his powers now confirmed, Domitian could dispense with flattering the Senate. He knew their role was merely ceremonial, and unlike his predecessors, he wasn't afraid to make that clear. Perhaps his terms as suffect consul had convinced him that the Senate itself was irrelevant, or nearly so, or it should be. His father had known the secret of the Senate's approval being only ceremonial, too, but Vespasian had maintained the facade of senatorial supremacy, the facade of republic. Now, though, Emperor Domitian turned Rome toward autocracy. Our sources, especially Tacitus and Pliny the Younger, are hostile to Domitian and portray him unfavorably. If you read a list of worst Roman emperors, Domitian is usually near the top somewhere. After researching Domitian, he seems to have been an effective and popular ruler during most of his reign. The people and the army were devoted to him, and he administered well until his last years. Those most opposed to him, though, were the Senate and their cohort, which included the writers who have survived to today. The disdain between princeps and Senate went both ways. Domitian moved power out of the halls of the Senate and into his court. To do this, he relied on men from the equestrian class who he appointed. Side note, I've been referring to this class as equestrians, but they're also sometimes called knights. He placed these knights or equestrians in positions of power once reserved for men of the senatorial class. Worse for the Senate, Domitian allowed equestrians to serve as judges of cases involving the senatorial class. This was a reversal of the Senate's traditional privileges. During Domitian's reign, several senators were exiled and several senators were executed, most for plots against him, but at least one was executed for sarcastic remarks aimed at Domitian. It's no wonder that the Senate later tarnished his memory. In his first decade of ruling, he was more restrained in persecuting the Senate, but following a rebellion we'll discuss at the end of this episode, he ratcheted up his purges. Our sources make Domitian out to be a dictator who was establishing himself as an absolute monarch. One piece of evidence they give is that he received the title Dominus, meaning Lord. Gone was the pretense that the emperor was merely a princeps, a first citizen. Now Domitian was placing himself clearly above the old rulers of the Republic. Again, this was the unspoken reality, but Domitian apparently made it explicit. On the other hand, all the unbiased evidence shows Domitian didn't title himself Lord. This title was given to him by the people, and he made a show of declining the title. Moreover, no coins or decrees were printed with the title Dominus. The Senate merely picked up on the people's flattery of their emperor and ran with it. Why did the people like him? Well, apart from checking the Senate's hubris, he made the lives of the common people in Rome better through public games, a building program, ensuring they were fed, and prosecuting immorality. As was fitting for a member of the family who built the Flavian amphitheater, Domitian was an avid supporter and enjoyer of the games. His favorite event took place outside the Colosseum, though, at the Circus Maximus, chariot racing. He was such a fan that he ordered 2 new factions be added to the 4 factions already in existence. The 4 traditional teams were the Greens, the Blues, the Whites, and the Reds. These 4 teams would continue to exist for centuries, at least into the 600s in Constantinople. To those 4 teams, Domitian added a purple and a gold team. They seem to have only lasted until his death. Each of the teams could field up to 3 chariots in a race. Each race traditionally consisted of 7 laps around the Circus Maximus. Besides chariot racing, Suetonius records that Domitian held a naval battle in the Colosseum, a feat which required redirecting aqueduct flow and flooding the arena. Gone were the Jovinal Games and the Neronia, the periodic athletic and artistic festivals implemented by Nero. In their place, though, Domitian reinstituted the Capitoline Games. They had once been common during the Republic, but had fallen into disuse. Both Caesar and Augustus had sporadically held the games, but it wasn't until Domitian that they were systematized and held on their 4-year cycle. As you could guess from his patronage, Domitian gained a reputation for very frequently attending all sorts of games. It was more often than the Senate thought fitting for the princeps. He could be seen sitting in his box, dressed in a purple toga and, according to Suetonius, with a golden crown. While I doubt the last part, wearing purple did nothing to convince the Senate he was not making himself a king. Domitian also made himself a standard of meticulous justice. He reined in the constant creep of corruption. He took such care to exercise restraint over the city's officials and the governors of the provinces that at no time were they more honest or just, whereas after his time we have seen many of them charged with all manner of offenses, says Suetonius. He also brought honor back to the religious offices in Rome. The Vestal Virgins were increasingly not living up to their name. Several have been caught openly breaking their oaths of celibacy. At least 2 were accused and executed. In 87, the senior Vestal was convicted of incest and faced the punishment of burial alive. Pliny the Younger, though, claims she was innocent. The state of the grain supply also reached Domitian's attention. Rome at this time was wholly dependent on imports, mostly from Egypt. Italy, of course, had once supplied Rome with most of its food. In the past decades, though, the grain fields of Italy had mostly switched to growing cash crops, often vineyards. This is a consequence of pan-Mediterranean trade. Why grow wheat and compete with the hyper-productive and cheap labor of Egypt when you can make significantly more money growing wine grapes? The problem came when shipments were interrupted or a drought hit Egypt. Domitian made an edict forbidding anyone to plant more vines in Italy. Maybe not the most economically productive solution, but one that helped mitigate food scarcity. Fitting with his micromanagement, Domitian soon took to tinkering with monetary policy. Under Vespasian, the coinage had been debased, leading to a slow creep of inflation. Domitian revalued the coinage, increasing the silver content of the denarius from 90% to 98%. Though, due to a financial crisis in 85, the value was reduced back down to 93.5%. This was still higher than his predecessors, and it brought down inflation and improved the standard of living for the people. There are claims from the ancient historians that Domitian emptied the treasury with his funding of the games, payments to the military, and public works program. Evidence had led modern historians, though, to believe he led a balanced budget. Lastly, the public loved to see his improvement and restoration of Rome. Domitian continued rebuilding of the city following the fire of 80 AD. Under his reign, the Temple of Jupiter completed its reconstruction. He added an upper deck to the Colosseum. He built the Odeon, a theater for music and plays, and he had an Egyptian obelisk erected, which can still be seen in the Piazza Navona in Rome. Also, Suetonius says, he provided for having the libraries, which were destroyed by fire, renewed at very great expense, seeking everywhere for copies of the lost works, and sending scribes to Alexandria to transcribe and correct them. Among his most famous constructions was the Arch of Titus, a triumphal arch placed on the Via Sacra depicting the victory of Vespasian and Titus over the Judean revolt. Its most famous engraving is of Roman soldiers carrying loot from the Jerusalem temple, including the great menorah. On its face was carved, "The Senate and the Roman people dedicate this to the deified Titus Vespasian Augustus, son of the deified Vespasian." I think this monument and its features helped to push back against the supposed spite Domitian had for Titus. Of course, part of the purpose of this arch was to remind the people of Rome, more than a decade afterward, both of what the Flavians had achieved and the connection Domitian had with the deified Titus and Vespasian. Domitian also became popular with the army. Soon after becoming emperor, Domitian increased the pay of all soldiers in the empire by at least a quarter. This act earned their devotion. They soon came to know his face. 2 years into his reign, Domitian set out for the Rhine frontier to finally gain the military glory he had so long been denied. Unprovoked, Domitian suddenly plunged Roman legions into the heart of the Germanic Chatti tribe's territory. This Germanic tribe, living across the Rhine, had been at peace with Rome since at least the 50s. Suetonius says the war was totally unnecessary, and Cassius Dio says the war broke a treaty Rome had with the Chatti. Domitian's surprise attack, according to our biased sources, seems to have been purely manufactured to give him a military victory. After crossing the Rhine, Roman soldiers formed wide lines and advanced across the wooded country toward the heart of the Chatti's lands. No pitched battles occurred. The Chatti resorted to guerrilla tactics. The bulk of the activity was in building Roman roads into the territory. The infrastructure was proof to all that Domitian had conquered new lands. In 84, while still in Germania, an exiled king of the Cherusci, along with other tribal leaders, came to his camp and paid homage to Domitian. This was meant to be a quick campaign. Get in, check off a victory, and get out. Domitian soon raced back to Rome to hold a triumph of his own where he would receive the title Germanicus for his conquests. The Senate turned up their nose at this minor campaign and called it a mock triumph behind his back. One lasting impact of this campaign, though, was in strengthening Roman control of the upper reaches of the Danube and Rhine rivers where the two nearly meet. In these upper reaches, both rivers are easily crossed by raiders. Better defenses were needed here. Domitian's campaign against the Chatti made the limes Germanicus possible, the defensive line of forts, ditches, and walls that protected this geographically unfortunate area. Domitian expanded the fort system already in place here, had new ditches dug, and new walls built along his new line of defense. Despite the benefits of this unprompted war against the Chatti, attacking this tribe would have consequences later for Domitian. Two other snippets from Domitian's reign are worth mentioning here. Both push the bounds of Roman exploration. First is a stone inscription found in 1948 in the country of Azerbaijan in the eastern Caucasus region near the Caspian Sea. The inscription reads, "Under Imperator Domitian, Caesar Augustus Germanicus, Lucius Julius Maximus, Legio 12 Fulminata." This is the easternmost known Latin inscription ever found. So, during the reign of Domitian, the 12th Legion was on some kind of expedition in the area, which was then called, confusingly, Albania, not to be confused with the modern Balkan country. Another similar note of Domitian's reign is the expedition of Julius Maternus. Maternus was a Roman trader who led an expedition from Leptis Magna on the Mediterranean coast of Libya and headed straight south into the Sahara Desert. With him was the king of the Garamantes, who must have found a route through the sands. These Garamantes were a Berber people who lived along the borders of the desert. His expedition hopped to the oasis of Kufra, then to the oasis of Archaea. They bypassed the dry Tibesti Mountains, and after 4 months in the desert, they entered wetter lands in the modern countries of Chad or Central African Republic. Here they traded and journeyed to Lake Chad, which was even larger in those days than it is today. Maternus returned to Rome with a 2-horned rhinoceros, which was shown in the Colosseum. This was not the first Roman expedition to sub-Saharan Africa. During Nero's reign, we talked about an expedition down the Nile, but that was far to the east. At least 3 other expeditions had crossed into Western Africa in the prior 100 years. Our sources for these expeditions are Pliny and the writer Ptolemy. Physical evidence of some kind of trade has been found in the form of Roman coins from the 1st century in central Mali. People moved far more in the ancient world than we give them credit for. Part 3. Caledonia. At the same time Maternus explored to the southern edges of the Romans' known world, the general Agricola in Britannia was leading Roman armies farther north than any had before. In the year 77, Agricola had become the new governor of Britannia. We briefly talked last time about his invasion of Wales, victory over the Ordovices, and his conquest of the island of Anglesey. After subduing Wales, he marched north. He used the new fort of Eboracum in the modern city of York as his base. Agricola reinforced the fort, then continued north. He raided into Scotland, called Caledonia by the Romans, and subdued the lowlands in the south of the region. In 81 or 82, Tacitus says Agricola crossed a body of water in the first ship and defeated a people unknown to the Romans. Most modern scholars propose this to have been a minor hop across either the Firth of Forth or the Firth of Clyde into southwest Scotland. Another fascinating theory is that he crossed over to Ireland and fought battles there. He definitely had given refuge to an exiled Irish king. Tacitus, who was Agricola's son-in-law and is our main source here, doesn't clarify things. He does state that Agricola insisted that he could have conquered Ireland with a single legion. But if he did step foot on the island, it was only as part of a minor incursion, perhaps to help the exiled Irish king. An Irish legend speaks of a king exiled as a boy to Britain who returned around this time at the head of an army to retake his throne. Romans in Ireland? Maybe. We do know Agricola was concerned with movement in the opposite direction. He built forts facing the coast to defend against Irish raiders. In 83, Agricola pushed further north with his army. His expedition was aided by a support fleet who mirrored his movements on the coast. The Caledonian tribes rose up and unified against him. They were led by Calgacus. Tacitus tells us that he was the most distinguished for birth and valor among the chieftains. The two sides met at Mons Graupius, far into the highlands, near the North Sea. Before the battle, Calgacus gave a speech to his men, probably invented entirely by Tacitus, but it's worth mentioning for its last line. Speaking of the Romans, Calgacus says they are robbers of the world. Neither the East nor the West has been able to satisfy them. Alone among men, they covet with equal eagerness poverty and riches. To robbery, slaughter, plunder, they give the lying name of empire. They make a solitude and call it peace. From this speech comes the phrase, they make a desert and call it peace. Calgacus had chosen the site of the battle. As the fighting began, the 30,000 Caledonians rushed downhill, led by a charge of the Caledonian chariots. The Romans had their auxiliary infantry at the front and their legions in reserve. The Roman auxiliaries smashed into the Caledonians in tight fighting. Among these soldiers were 4 cohorts of the Batavi, who we talked about last time. As the Caledonians were being pushed back, some of their forces attempted to flank the Romans, but their position was left open to attack by the Roman cavalry, and these forces too were cut down. Without the legions even becoming involved, the Caledonian morale broke and they fled. Tacitus says more than 10,000 of the Caledonians had died, with only 360 deaths on the Roman side. The remainder of the Caledonians escaped, though, and hid in the highlands. Agricola led his army further to the North Sea. From here, the leader of his fleet was instructed to continue sailing along the north coast. The fleet continued on and then soon followed the turn of the coast to the west. They passed between the tip of Scotland and the Orkney Islands, and before long they turned south again. They had confirmed once and for all that Britain was indeed an island, something that had been an open question up to this point. Agricola was recalled from his governorship in 85. He had served as governor for 8 years, much longer than was normal. Returning to Rome, he was awarded with triumphal decorations and a statue, though not the highest honor, an actual triumph. Tacitus implies Domitian harbored jealousy for Agricola's conquests. Whatever the case, he had been allowed to continue those conquests to their end, was honored for his successes, and was offered the governorship of the wealthy province of Africa. He turned it down. Instead, Agricola lived the remaining years of his life on his family estate in Narbonensis, modern Provence, France. All of Britain had been conquered by the Romans, thanks to Agricola's work, but it could not be held. Tacitus says, Britain was wholly conquered and promptly given up, which I think is at least partially a projection of his discontentment about the failures of his father-in-law's successors. It would have taken a larger force than the Romans were ready to spare to control these northern wilds. 20,000 Caledonian warriors survived to fight another day. Construction began on a legionary camp near Perth in Scotland on the Firth of Tay in 87. Before it could be completed, the legion which was to be stationed there was withdrawn and all lands to the north of here were given up. In my opinion, the Romans would have been better off if they had in fact conquered and held the whole of Britain. If we follow the advice of Augustus and use natural borders as the edge of the empire, no better border existed than the North Sea. I suspect Ireland would have needed to be conquered as well to have really been safe. In reality, we'll see the Romans give up the northern third of the island and build a wall to defend their side of the island. If the whole of Britain could have been subdued, fewer legions would have been needed on the island, limiting its potential as a source of rebellion and bringing more soldiers to other troublesome borders. But yes, taming the wild inhabitants of these remote lands would have taken considerable effort, an effort Domitian could not afford to spare. With our hindsight, I think the payoff would have been worth it, though. Instead, Agricola was recalled, the forts abandoned, the legions pulled back. Soon after Agricola's departure, One of the 4 legions stationed in Britain, the second, was moved off the island and transferred to the Danube frontier. What was going on at the Danube frontier that required more legions? Well, you see, Part 4. Meet the Dacians. Let me start over. What was going on at the Danube frontier that required more legions? Well, you see, a people called the Dacians were becoming increasingly troublesome. These Dacians were an Indo-European people, not Celtic or Scythian or German, but probably related to the Thracians. Their homeland was across the Danube River from the Roman province of Moesia, in what's today Romania. The Dacians had been a perennial problem for Rome, raiding across the Danube River into Moesia. During the time of Julius Caesar, the Dacian tribes had briefly been united. Caesar considered a campaign against them, but they soon broke apart again. Tiberius and Caligula had paid subsidies to Dacian tribes to keep them out of Roman territory. Over the 60s, though, a king named Scorilo began to reunite the tribes of Dacia under his banner. This king attempted to take advantage of the chaos in the year 69 during the year of the 4 emperors, when nearby legions were withdrawn. He crossed the river and entered Moesia, but he had poor timing. Just as he arrived, Mucianus, the ally of Vespasian, was marching through the area and soundly defeated the Dacian invaders. Scorilo died soon after, possibly as a result of this failed campaign. 15 years later, under the reign of Domitian, a new powerful king named Decebalus now united Dacia. In 85, Decebalus led a force of Dacians across the Danube into Moesia. The Romans were caught by surprise, the 5th Legion was defeated, and the governor of the province was killed. This raid had quickly turned into a major challenge to Roman authority. Domitian responded with vigor, and he, along with the Praetorian prefect Cornelius Fuscus, personally led the Praetorians into Moesia. They were met there by the 6th Legion, and Domitian ordered the 1st Legion come from Germania Superior, and the 2nd Legion came from Britannia to assist in the operations here. Historians debate the details of what happened next. It's clear that Fuscus was successful in clearing the Dacians out of Moesia. What's unclear is whether Domitian only dropped off Fuscus and the Praetorians before heading home, or whether he was present on campaign with them. Either way, Domitian was not present for the next move. In 87, Fuscus crossed the Danube and entered Dacia on a punitive expedition. In these unknown and uncivilized lands, the Roman army was ambushed by Decebalus and the Dacians. Fuscus attempted to rally his men, but they were defeated. Fuscus himself was killed in the fighting. A significant number escaped back to Roman territory, but many were killed or taken as captive. Command of the operations against the Dacians was handed to a man named Titius Julianus in 88. He scrounged together a force and crossed the Danube River back into Dacia. The Roman army, carefully this time, marched north. Near the chief city of Dacia, Tepai, Julianus defeated an army led by Decebalus, but the Dacian king escaped. Rather than follow up on this victory, the Romans met with Decebalus to talk peace. Outside circumstances necessitated diplomacy here. Not far upstream, the Romans were struggling with a large threat from the Marcomanni, the Sarmatians, and the Quadi. They were ostensibly allies to Rome, but all had refused to provide support in Rome's war with the Dacians. Skirmishes broke out between the two sides, and Domitian had their diplomats executed. Worse than this, the governor of Germania Superior had rebelled, and legions were needed to restore order. So, after the victory of Julianus, when Decebalus had sued for peace, the Romans had leapt at the opportunity. Perhaps a little too eagerly, because the terms were not favorable. The Romans agreed to pay the Dacians 8 million sesterces every year, about 0.5% of Rome's total income each year. In exchange, the Dacians would respect the Danube as a border with Rome, release their captives, and become a client kingdom of Rome, at least on paper.
On the other hand, Domitian had to send Decebalus several engineers who helped the Dacians construct formidable defenses.
Let's pause for a second and reflect on what just happened. The Dacians had raided a province, killed a governor, and defeated a legion. Then, when the Romans entered Dacia, they were soundly defeated and a general was killed. This was a serious situation. Domitian gets flack for these losses and for the not-so-favorable deal the Romans made with Decebalus. But I think we should give Domitian some credit here. It would have been easier and safer to have sought a diplomatic peace after Fuscus's army was defeated. This would have put them in an even more unfavorable negotiating position than actually happened, and whatever peace they agreed on would have been even more costly. Instead of taking the easy way, though, Domitian facilitated the victory at Tepai, which allowed more equitable negotiations. His deal with the Dacians wasn't popular, as we'll see in the next section, but I think Domitian should get credit for taking the risk of sending another expedition into Dacia and securing a peace that wasn't punitive. This fragile peace held between Rome and Dacia.
Domitian didn't count on it to last, though. He moved in 2 cavalry units on top of the other 2 legions he had transplanted to the area. There will be peace here throughout the rest of Domitian's reign, but Decebalus will live long enough to see conflict with the Romans again. Part 5. Another Rhineland Rebellion. Although Domitian had the favor of the public and the army, the elite never became fans. Something to do with his removing their privileges and placing lower-born equestrians above them in positions of power and in the courts. Naturally, several plots against Domitian were organized. The most significant of these occurred when the governor of Germania Superior rose in rebellion against Domitian. This rebel governor was named Saturninus. He had served as a general previously and had held other offices in Rome, highlighted by one of those suffect consulships in 82 or 83. So he was well connected in the capital and was personally familiar with discontent aimed at Domitian. In 87, he became governor of Germania Superior, administering from his capital at Mainz. In 89, Saturninus took the 2 legions stationed there, the 14th and the 21st, and planned a rebellion. Domitian's military failures, specifically his removal of Agricola and the embarrassing losses against the Dacians, were the specific triggers. Supporting Saturninus was the Chatti tribe, holding onto their grudge against Domitian for his surprise attack on their homeland 6 years earlier. To the disappointment of Saturninus, the plot was discovered before the rebellion could spread beyond Germania Superior. The response was swift and conclusive. The governor of Germania Inferior, Lappius Maximus, brought his legions. A procurator named Norbanus of Raetia in modern Switzerland brought several cohorts of auxiliaries, and from Hispania, a legate named Trajan led a legion north. We'll meet this Trajan guy again next decade. Domitian himself rode toward the Rhine, leading the Praetorian Guard. As the loyal armies reached Germania Superior in winter of 89, Saturninus readied his 2 legions to fight. His plan had been to surprise Domitian's army. As the fighting began, the Chatti would join the fight and overwhelm the loyal Romans. The Chatti would have to cross the frozen Rhine, but that shouldn't have been a problem. The river was always frozen there that time of year. But in 89, unseasonable weather caused the river to suddenly thaw. The Chatti could not cross. Saturninus was left alone. The loyal armies marched through Germania Superior and defeated Saturninus and his rebel legions in only 24 days. The rebellion had been crushed. The 2 rebellious legions were moved out of the area. The 21st was sent to the Danube borders in Pannonia. It was soon dictated that 2 legions must not share the same quarters to prevent future mutinies. Domitian's allies were rewarded for their support. Lappius Maximus was given the lucrative governorship of Syria.
A man named Nerva, who may have been instrumental in revealing the conspiracy before it spread, was soon rewarded with a consulship. Trajan appears to have stayed in the area and engaged in minor campaigns against the Chatti. Norbanus was rewarded by becoming a Praetorian prefect. Before leaving Germania Superior, Norbanus rushed to the personal quarters of Saturninus. Domitian must have made clear his intent to purge any connection to the uprising. Norbanus attempted to limit the extent of Domitian's actions by burning Saturninus' correspondences. We can only speculate, but Saturninus must have sent out feelers to many in the administration of the empire. Perhaps there had been more interest in the rebellion than actually materialized. Even with Norbanus' actions, Domitian's response was swift and definitive. Saturninus and his supporters were executed, and their heads were put on stakes outside the Forum in Rome. A brutal sight not seen in a generation. I have been apologetic toward Domitian during this decade due to his good governance and popularity, despite the maligning of his ancient critics. This rebellion of Saturninus, though, seems to have marked a transition in his psyche. This began the darkest period of Domitian's reign. If the Senate disliked him before, they would soon fear him. If they thought him styling himself a king, they would soon see in him a tyrant. That's it for the 80s. Before I go, just a reminder to send in end-of-century questions to 202decades@gmail.com. If the end-of-century episode hasn't been released yet, it's not too late. Finally, I've started up the 202 Decades Facebook page once again, so be sure to follow the show there. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.